Welcome. Welcome to all on behalf of the Brochet Foundation of Geneva, Switzerland. We're hosting a panel today with alumni of the Brochet Foundation to talk about COVID preparedness so far. What does bioethics say about it, and what can we expect in the future? So we've had enough time pass for our panel to evaluate a range of questions about COVID preparedness. We have vaccines remarkably quickly, but the distribution has been fragmented and slow in most cases. Who gets vaccine priority when the vaccine rollout is so slow? How can we improve acceptance of vaccination? What can we learn from this pandemic to help us cope with the next one? How about the intellectual property issues raised by this whirlwind of competing vaccines and other treatments? And can we create a public health infrastructure that will work for the next pandemic? So let me introduce our panelists. I'm Professor Barry Furrow. I'm the director of the Health Law program at the Klein School of Law at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Our first panelist is Professor Reed Peiritz, Emeritus Professor of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. We have Professor Lee Rich, Professor of Health Services Administration at Georgia Southern University. Professor Dina Davis, Presidential Endowed Chair in Health and Professor of Religion Studies at Lehigh University. Professor Stephen X, Senior Lecturer, Social Anthropology, School of Social and Political Science, University of Edinburgh. Professor Robert Cook Deegan, Professor, School for the Future of Innovation in Society and Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, Arizona State University. And so that's the panel. Let's begin with Professor Peiritz.
Greetings to all. It's an honor to be a part of this esteemed panel. My topics could be categorized as dealing with the macro and micro ethical issues surrounding vaccination. But it's difficult to separate the ethical issues from the logistic issues. So let me begin with some comments about where at least some of us in the United States stand with regard to vaccination. Let me say I'm unaware of any truly flagrant examples of logistics and ethics such as have occurred in South America, where the rich or the politically well-connected advance to the front of the line, although that may be happening some places in the States. Each of the 50 United States is divided into counties, each with its own elected administrators, and they provide essential services, many of which include health departments. My own state of Pennsylvania, with about 10 million citizens, has 67 counties. Most are in rural areas whose residents depend on coal mining, oil drilling, and farming. Only 10 of the 67 counties are in urban areas, which contain 70% of the population. The smallest county in Pennsylvania has just over 4,000 individuals. The largest county, Philadelphia, has 1.5 million. So you see there's quite a discrepancy. When the COVID vaccines first became available, the federal government, which under Donald Trump had virtually no coherent plan to deal with COVID, decided to provide doses of vaccine to the individual state governments, which would then distribute it to the counties as they saw fit. In Pennsylvania, there was one exception. The federal government provides vaccine directly to the city of Philadelphia. So that the federal government, in essence, controls how many individuals in Philadelphia can be vaccinated. Only this week did the federal government establish its own center for distributing vaccines in Philadelphia. Now, since so much of what transpires in the United States depends on politics, federal, state, local, it came as no surprise as to how the system was functioning once the vaccines became available. But only recently were systemic data released. In Pennsylvania, the 4 counties with the largest percentage of population vaccinated were the very smallest and most rural. 4 of the largest counties, all suburbs of Philadelphia, had the least number of vaccinated residents per 100,000 population. The rural counties are uniformly Republican in political leanings, while the suburbs and largest cities are strongly Democratic. Now, maldistribution could not only be due to politics, but if logistics play a major role, then those counties closest to major cities might be expected to do at least as well. Some issues are clearly racial and economic. Poor and minority citizens, who also are the most likely to develop and die of COVID, tend to live in cities and have less access to health care and are less likely to have computers, let alone the skills to try to use them to get appointments. As an example, my neighbor, who has a PhD in economics, spent 4 straight days starting at 5 a.m. on his computer attempting to get an appointment for his 75-year-old father-in-law who has several chronic illnesses. He eventually did, but at a hospital 50 miles away. And that's just indicative of the struggles that many people encounter. The New York Times has established a website where one can put in the name of a state and determine who is being declared essential and which cohort of citizens is next in line of priority. Certainly one of the fundamental ethical issues is the definition of essential. And that's what most struggles over prioritization of vaccine distribution have met with. Who is essential? Frontline health workers certainly are, and that's uniform. Otherwise, what about the administrators of hospitals? Are they essential? What about the cafeteria workers? Are they essential? Barry, do I have another minute?
You can take another minute.
So an important example also arose here in Philadelphia, where, as in most places in the United States, schools have been closed. When the decision was made to try to reopen the elementary and middle schools here in Philadelphia, it was the teachers who said, well, we're essential. And the teacher unions refused to allow their teachers to go back to work, that is to open schools, unless they were vaccinated. And after protracted negotiations, teachers began to be vaccinated and schools began to be open. So this was just an example of how political action could go a long way to determine who is essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. Our next presenter is Professor Rich.
All right, I'm going to try to get my screen set up here. Let's see.
Got it, Lee.
Is it working? Aha, yep. Fabulous. Thank you so much. All right, so last year, a student recommended Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air. One passage stood out, as did others about that deadly trek on Everest. Like John Oliver, who recently explored not the current pandemic, but the next one, I began wondering what we would learn. Reading about Everest, 5 themes emerged in where we are failing to learn from the pandemic and why we may be doomed to repeat it. Krakauer concluded that dissecting the tragic events of '96 to reduce future death was wishful thinking and attempting to learn from the mistakes in exercise in self-deception. Climbing mountains will never be a safe, predictable, rule-bound enterprise. Hegel said something similar about reflective history. Peoples and governments never have learned anything from history. Each period exhibits a condition of things so idiosyncratic, a general principle gives no help. Like COVID, Everest is both known and unknown. Its geography transgresses boundaries. Its weather is unpredictable. Every climb is different. Yet today, treks couldn't occur without knowledge from before. Expeditions and strategies are not completely developed anew. So too with COVID. Even Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year discusses social distancing, restricted travel, quarantines, home confinement, along with what the plague meant regarding trade and individual liberties. More recently, agencies and scholars have been promising not if, but when. A 2019 tabletop exercise mimicked what we would see the following year, and flus of last century and other epidemics offer comparable lessons and tutorials. Actually, so if we look at Nick Heil's conclusions after the 2006 Everest season, here's what he said. He said, look, too much has been written, said, filmed, and photographed for anyone not to be aware of the risks of climbing to 29,000 feet. So while each pandemic or each climb on Everest might be unique and individual, some general principles could have helped. Krakauer and others also highlight an every client for oneself approach and how climbers step past others in need. One team stated that every climber should be held accountable for their actions, even on the brink of death. This has occurred with COVID, especially here in the United States, with Trump and McConnell suggesting states be left to go bankrupt, or FEMA commandeering supplies, or people protesting distancing and masks, claiming that if they get sick, then they will bear the consequences. But missing from this discussion is recognition that the risk of illness is not something one bears alone. The right to risk exposure places others in harm's way and begs legal and ethical questions about state and individual responsibility. Krakauer sums up many COVID experiences. He felt disconnected from his fellow climbers, how they were a team in name only and would ascend as individuals linked by neither rope nor any deep sense of loyalty. Leaders and systems also must welcome critiques without reprisal to ensure errors are caught early. Yet with Everest and COVID, many have experienced moral distress in speaking up. Krakauer had specifically been indoctrinated not to question his guide's judgment, a safety protocol that left him useless when his climbing experience could have helped. With COVID, hospitals have limited what healthcare providers can post on social media and whether they can speak to the press. Some have been warned, reassigned, fired, even publicly shamed. Additionally, primary prevention pales against medical heroics and must defend outlays for disasters that never emerge. Today, we even fail to learn from undeniable failures like the power grid in Texas. And yet a public health approach is used in national defense with mountains of money for preventive efforts. Finally, we must address short-term strategic thinking that overtakes the common good. On Everest, reaching the top is often the only achievement celebrated, even though Sherpas, guides, prior treks, and socioeconomics also help. With COVID, to bolster their own power, many politicians have stuck to downplaying scripts and ineffective or dangerous ideas, and partisan media mock masks and tracing. Like those after their own summits, if we are encouraged to engage in a place where brute strength and ruthlessness overrule compassion, civility, and fair play, how can we conquer this pandemic or learn for future ones? What will we learn, not just today, but tomorrow, as we look back and the present becomes past? It certainly is not useless to revert to the similar circumstances of prior times, as Hegel suggests, but he is likely correct that our pallid shades of memory will struggle in vain with the life and freedom of the present.
Thank you. That sets the stage for discouraging future work. All right, Professor Davis.
Thank you. Just before I start, a shout out to, thank you, Lee, and a shout out to the at least one book and film by a woman named Arlene Blum, B-L-U-M, about the women's expedition to Annapurna, which was successful and extremely different in its ethos. And also read, I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on your presentation. Something I'm not sure a lot of people have noticed, but if you roll out the vaccine by age, if you start with people 75 and older and then 65, which seems, extraordinarily rational and defensible. But if you think about the fact that after Native Americans, African Americans have the lowest life expectancy in this country, then you notice that they are actually disproportionately underrepresented. And, they are less likely to get to 75. And with a statistician colleague, we figured out that you had to go below age 50 before you began to erase that problem and get parity. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about today was vaccine mandates, which have been a political and ethical issue in the US for many decades, revolving around vaccination against childhood diseases such as measles and mumps. So in a way, we're all set. We've teed up for the coming discussion. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that once the vaccines are approved, not with an emergency authorization, but with a standard approval, which should be coming within a year, it is perfectly reasonable for private and government entities to require vaccination for just about any situation in which one unvaccinated person could pass the virus on to others. This could include public and private K through 12 schools, colleges, public libraries, employment in nursing homes, restaurants, healthcare facilities, people who want to fly in an airplane, and so on. There will always be people who cannot be vaccinated, who will be vulnerable for medical reasons, as well as people who got the vaccination, but for whom it didn't take, and we won't know who those people are going forward, right? And I believe that those people's safety takes precedence. I do not believe in religious or personal exemptions to vaccination requirements. There are constitutional issues here that I don't have the time to go into. But one thing that happens, and we saw that in Vermont when they dropped their personal exemption and kept their religious one, is that all those personal exemptions just became religious. And since we have no constitutional way to define religion, that didn't help. When we shut down all but medical exemptions, as happened recently in California for vaccination against childhood diseases, what we saw is that most people complied. Furthermore, whether one's vaccine hesitancy is based on race, personal philosophy, or whatever, it tends to be culturally inflected, so that people who refuse vaccination tend to live or work near each other. In the USA, for example, Waldorf schools attract anti-vaccination families. And in 1919, before the pandemic, there were Waldorf schools in New York State where 60% of the children were not vaccinated against childhood diseases. And no big surprise, we saw measles outbreaks in some of those schools. In Vermont, a few counties account for nearly all the children who are not vaccinated. So rather than being scattered randomly and relatively harmlessly among the population at large, unvaccinated people tend to live in clusters, which give rise to disease breakouts. I recognize that in the United States, there are racial implications to this stance, but, and I'm certainly not alone in saying this, we have to be really careful here. On the one hand, we have to respect the medical mistrust, which is grounded not merely on the history of, for example, the Tuskegee experiment, but also on things that happen right now, today, and yesterday, and tomorrow in the experience of Black people and other people of color as they interact with the medical establishment. But on the other hand, that could turn into an excuse really easily, right? So as opposed to Reid's really dramatic point about rural counties with small populations who vote Republican and whom, you didn't say this, but I imagine they're overwhelmingly white, that, we see that is that it would be easy to say, well, Black people are just turning this down because they don't know any better and they're the victims of medical mistrust and it's not our fault. A very good article in 538 debunks the idea that the slower uptake in COVID vaccination among African Americans is primarily due to medical mistrust, rather primarily due to unequal access to vaccine distribution sites for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned. But at the same time, for reasons we're all painfully aware of, there is a good deal of distrust. But the response to that, I believe, is to deploy more resources such as Hip Hop Public Health, Queen Latifah, who returned to her hometown of Newark yesterday to very publicly receive her first shot, organized efforts by Black churches, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Davis. Professor X.
Hello, yeah, thank you. Let me start sharing my screen as well. Can you see my slide?
Yeah.
Got it, Stefan.
Excellent. So I'm gonna talk about kind of this question of, what have we learned about preparedness so far? And, now we're in March 2021. Today is the anniversary of the WHO declaring it a pandemic. So it's interesting to just go back in time a little bit and, for example, remind ourselves, about what was considered to be preparedness just recently. So in 2019, this chart came out, the countries best prepared to deal with a pandemic: United States #1, United Kingdom #2. And, it's just basically laughing out loud now, because there seems to have been something, completely amiss in terms of how we even measure pandemic preparedness there. And, me living in the UK, it's been terrible and painful just to see how enormously unprepared the country was, and really seems to have been among the least prepared countries in the world. So one of the things I went through also is just sort of what was actually done in terms of pandemic preparedness. And 2011, 2016 were two major exercises in this regard. And when you read the entire plan for this preparedness, you find that none of any of what we've actually experienced was in any way preconceived, thought through, considered. This entire slew of lockdown measures, for example, is just something that seems to have crossed nobody's mind even back then. And for example, the 2011 plan mumbles something about all sectors would have substantial economic and social consequences. And now you wonder, how is it possible that no one ever thought of modeling this, thinking through this, establishing the criteria for what needs to be looked out even. And the same with the 2016 exercise Cygnus. And part of the problem, I would argue, is definitely also that there is almost no social science, bioethics, humanities inclusion in any of these expert panels on pandemic preparedness. It just has never crossed anyone's mind in the government that these people, beyond epidemiology and virology, could have anything to contribute. And it's just, recently that a few economists made it on these panels. And now also, I think there's a grand total of one anthropologist who is on one of these UK panels. But it's just an enormous underrepresentation of, of expertise and thinking through, the fallout on many levels beyond health. And of course, it remains a massive problem also just to think what is the relative value of these different interventions, right? So this remains the key problem. So we've had vaccinations only since a few months, and they're being rolled out, and they're great. And until the vaccinations came, and still now, of course, definitely in the UK, I'm still living under basically full lockdown measures here, were these non-pharmacological interventions, which then had all sorts of strands and modalities to them, physical contact, border checks, travel bans, quarantine measures, physical distancing, workplace closures, transport, and so on, contact tracing, all sorts of stuff, and these discussions about face masks as well. But the relative value of just how much is it worth to invest in any one of these measures, what kind of returns do they actually give in terms of health, but also in terms of socioeconomic factors and civic values, has never really been established so far, right? So there are massive costs, but we still don't really know how to measure all this. Just a few days ago, it was in the news here in the UK about test and trace, which is this, I think they spent something like 40 billion pounds on developing this mobile phone app to basically, you get an alert if you've been close to somebody who then tested positive for the virus. And, it's 40 billion pounds, which basically went down the drain without any effect on, no life was saved, no one was spared anything at all. And it just seems to be, it's been branded the most wasteful and inept public spending program of all time. And again, it's the question of what's the relative value of these interventions and how do we measure this? How do we assess this? And of course, what we faced really very strongly, I think, and which really came to light fully when the pandemic really broke out from March, is this epistemic unpreparedness on an epic scale, right? So just to remind ourselves also, the WHO, for example, also had never really considered lockdown measures. And for example, even in January, they thought that the Wuhan lockdown was just an outlandishly extreme measure that is not considered anywhere else. International Monetary Fund said we've never really had any meaningful sense of what would come here when all sorts of measures were enacted in India, very strong lockdown, but also, a massive impact on people's livelihoods, poverty levels being set back by 30 years, for example. Was that also worth it, basically, what has been happening in India? And again, no one is really able to tell. Or, again, so not just India, where I do all my work really, but also in other countries around the world in terms of poverty impact. And just a few days ago, there was this news about Africa and the procurement of vaccines there. And again, sort of this calculation that if it would cost $27 billion for the rich countries to support a vaccination program for Africa, and it would deliver this enormous return on investment. And if that's not being done, then the damage is almost $10 trillion for the global economy. But again, sort of how are these things measured? How do we value the relative value of these interventions? And I think it's still so completely up in the air. And there are, of course, basic criteria in place, but the big picture, I think, and all the nuances, we still don't really know. And that has to do with this enormous unpreparedness epistemically in terms of how we should value all these different kinds of interventions there. And just to end, one thing I've been working on in the last few years is a sort of value theory that tries to actually square qualitative and quantitative measures with each other, and which is able to sort of capture relative value, not just in money, but also in other dimensions as well. And one very important part of this is just the realization that, you know, you can, like, all valuations are comparisons of one way or another. You're always comparing two or more things to each other, entities, interventions to each other. And the valuations really sort of need certain kinds of criteria. What are you actually looking for? What are the measures that you're applying? And these are modulated by a whole range of factors also that come into this, you know, trust, transparency, routinization in these valuations, for example. And basically my argument is that we're still at the early stages of even understanding sort of how to actually value the different kinds of interventions that have been done there. And to that extent, you know, going towards you know, the next pandemic, Lee has already told us that it's not a question of if, but when. And, you know, I think this is super important for kind of preparedness towards the next pandemic, also just to have a much better sense of what the criteria of valuation are that we should actually apply there. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Cook-Deegan.
So Barry, thanks so much. So I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., just south of Washington, D.C., the heart of chaos here in the United States. And I'm going to focus on the innovation system. And I'm going to make historical analogies to the flu episode of a century ago, the 1918 flu, that is known as the Spanish flu, but actually probably started in Kansas. And also to policies that emerged during World War II. And I'm going to make some comparisons. And I'm going to start with good news. The good news is we have ridiculously effective vaccines that were developed within a year. And that's actually an astonishing story. Now compare that to what happened in the 1918 flu. We actually didn't even know the bug that caused the 1918 flu until the 1940s. And there were really no effective treatments that were ever discovered during the 1918 flu. So basically that was a pure management of a pestilence that the only techniques for thwarting it were social techniques of distancing and trying to reduce infection. And a lot of people died. The story of this pandemic is going to be quite different, because the end story, the end game, is going to be a really long tail, because new variants are going to emerge, and this is an RNA virus that's going to continue to have tricks up its sleeves, and this story is not over. But the worst of it is we're probably nearing the beginning of the end of the worst peak of the current pandemic, and largely because of this miraculous development of vaccines. So what's that good news based on? Well, it's based on people doing research on funny bugs. And remember, coronaviruses cause, there are 4 coronaviruses that cause colds. People have been studying them for a long time, but was not a priority, believe me. And there are a few animal models of those. But nonetheless, despite the fact that it actually didn't have any foreseeable health impacts, there were a lot of people studying coronaviruses. I shouldn't say a lot. There were some people studying coronaviruses, and they were trying to understand the very basic dynamics of how can this RNA virus, which should be wildly unstable, theoretically its genome is way too big to be made out of RNA, because RNA is really unstable, and yet it has a 30,000 base pair genome. How does that be? Well, it turns out that it is the only organism on the planet that's known to have an enzyme that repairs RNA. So it's scanning itself for errors, and that means it's vulnerable. It means we can go after that enzyme and affect it, and it would not affect our bodies. It would only affect the virus. Moreover, the vaccines that have been developed are ridiculous that they work. I mean, it's just insane. You take a piece of RNA and you pack it with a bunch of little fat particles, inject it into somebody's arm, and they produce the protein that's going to elicit an incredibly strong immune response. It's ridiculous that these things work, but they do. That's based on 2 decades of science, and most crucially, figuring out which piece of RNA should be stuck into those viruses. And the targeting turns out to have been really, really good. We don't know whether it's going to work for all of the variants that are beginning to emerge, but it's a remarkable, remarkable scientific story. So that's part of the good news. Prospects of treatments, remarkably effective vaccines, and that's kind of the end of the good news. The bad news, of course, is the stuff that we've been talking about. This innovation is necessary but not sufficient. And we have discovered that the weaknesses in our system. Thank you, Stefan, for displaying that graph of preparedness, because the US came out #1 among all the nations as being the most prepared. Why? Because we have a biotech industry, we have testing capacity, we have the CDC, we have the NIH, we got money sloshing around in biotech and pharmaceuticals. We're just ready for this, right? And then it turns out that, gosh, we can deliver these widgets and things that can save people's lives. And our system of healthcare and our public health infrastructure is pathetically underfunded and basically incompetent. And so how does, it's really illustrated the weaknesses of the healthcare system. But I'm going to revert to the innovation system and the role of intellectual property, because one of the other things that's really interesting about this pandemic is that it has brought tools of policy to the fore that haven't really been used since World War II. If you think about, how did we get these vaccines? Well, it turns out that the Moderna vaccine and actually the BioNTech vaccine were developed with government money at the front end. In the case of Moderna, it was actually originally the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and then the National Institutes of Health. They had done a lot of homework before this pandemic ever hit, not knowing what it was going to be used for, but a generic technology that could develop vaccines very quickly. So that within 2 weeks of when the Chinese scientist violated Chinese policy and made public the sequence of the virus, they were able within 2 weeks to have a vaccine that was ready to test in animals. It's a remarkably fast time from discovery of sequence to having a widget that might be able to do something. And those are the very vaccines that have turned out to be highly effective. But the thing that I think is most interesting is one of the things that we've learned is when there is political will and you're willing to spend money and take chances, you can actually have the government pay for manufacturing capability, for the R&D, and to guarantee a back market. And we can make things move really fast. And we can actually deploy vaccines into people's bodies without having to worry about who's going to pay for it too much. I have to have some caveats on that, but basically this vaccine has been incorporated into our health system in such a way that people should not have to pay for their vaccines, which reduces the usual pathologies of the American healthcare system, which those of you living in Europe and in rational democracies don't have to worry about, but we do. And this has pretty much bypassed that. And one of the other things that's really been striking is the degree of information sharing and cooperation among the companies. So that this agreement between Merck and J&J to manufacture a vaccine made by another major competitor is kind of unusual. And the other unusual thing has been that patents haven't yet gotten in the way. We don't know if that's going to stay true. And the industry is fighting tooth and nail to make sure that things don't change too much. But I think the public sentiment that has supported making sure that these vaccines are widely available and the drugs will be if they ever turn out to work has, I think, changed the game probably. So the answer to our question is, what have we learned from this? Is I don't think I know yet, but I suspect that the intellectual property rules have probably shifted under the feet of the industry. And we will see a new framework for thinking more about the public health outcomes and health outcomes in relation to intellectual property rights than we have seen leading up to the pandemic. And I don't think that's going to be reversible. So let's leave it there and open it up. And I think you're going to finish this up, Barry. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say, and then I will turn it over to the group of us to chat a bit, and then we can take questions from whoever is watching. And it looks like we have 34 participants at this point. So that includes us, but it sounds like a good group. Okay, so I'm going to follow up on what you said, because I think I'm an institutionalist, and I like to see where government money goes. I'm a fan of NIH, and it seems to me, to paraphrase our hero of the Matrix, we need money, lots of money, lots of government money. And I'm looking at the WHO Bloomberg 7 directions for stopping the next pandemic, and it sort of captures things that need to be done and how much money it's probably going to take to do it. Research to identify new viruses. It's going on, I'm sure, as we speak, but does it include climate change, environmental factors, some of the variables that Stefan is getting at, things that really have an effect on breeding the connections between the animal world and humans and creating virus spread? Do we have global surveillance possible? Is it possible to set up systems? And this is beyond my technical knowledge. Do we have capacity to get country data or even county data to catch things that are percolating in the system? And I think there we talk about primary care systems that actually work. Cuba is a good example of that. The US is not. We're a good primary system with people who are also now attuned to detection of oddities that pop up in treating patients would be very helpful. Money, money, money so far. We need better vaccine platforms that allow us to be ready for a variety of different viruses. I can't speak to that technically. I just know it sounds like a good idea. It's more money for research. And we've got to coordinate the hell out of this system, which the US is terrible at. And it wasn't just Trump, although Trump had a lot to do with deconstructing the coordination potential that was already there. We need much better coordination models, and that's where public health education comes in, and replacing the 60,000 public health workers that have been lost over since the 2008 recession. We have a lot of building to do, not just rebuilding. And we need, and here I think is where lots of other fields than biotech come in. We need communication tools to fight falsehoods. You need to know how to market truth as well as marketing false truth. So it seems to me there's a lot to do. And if you keep up with the literature, I'm sure as you all do, there are thousands of things being published now in preprints. It's only going to get more insane. And I just hope out of this something good emerges. So that's my quick summary of our want list for the future. So who would like to connect the dots? And Stefan, I liked your point about nobody in the humanities or social sciences. I feel that way about my university. Nobody on the board of trustees knows anything really about what the teaching enterprise is like. It's all about money, and it drives me crazy. So I think there are lots of different insights we haven't seen as we try to figure out the next pandemic.
Barry, we do have a question in the chat box that looks like it might be best directed to Dina about whether vaccination should be made mandatory in a country like India.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dina's having trouble getting off of mute,
Yeah.
It looks like. Anybody else want to take a crack at that, Stefan?
Should
Sorry.
I
Yeah, there
I'm
we go.
sorry.
There we got Dina.
You want to go?
Sorry, Stefan. Just quickly, I mean, it's kind of a premature question, right? Because the first question is, can India, in fact, hopefully with international help, blanket the country with vaccination? And I know that there, just as in the US, there are, issues of mistrust here. I know that with polio vaccinations, for example, there are issues of mistrust with some Muslim communities fearing that it's a plot by Hindu communities and so on. But in theory, yes, I do. Stefan.
I mean, India has a very complex, long history also of forcible health interventions, particularly sort of forced sterilizations during the 1970s and so on. And so in many ways, India is a particularly fraught place for like anything that really forces people to undergo any kind of interventions. So I would be much more hesitant to just sort of blanket say, yes, this is a great idea, particularly with the political climate that you have at the moment in India. And there's a pretty strong shift to, much more authoritarian politics at the moment, and, sort of curtailment of freedoms also of academics and of free speech and so on. And so I would say no.
Okay. I mean, it's true that when I first heard, I don't know, pre-Modi anyway, that some Muslim people were worried that polio shots were a plot by Hindus to make Muslims sterile. I thought, oh, come on, give me a break. But now that seems like a much more rational fear. I agree.
The fear runs deep, and I don't think it's, I mean, making anything mandatory in this kind of way will also lead to a lot of abuse of civil rights and curtailment of civil rights in some way or another. And so I would definitely not. And yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question also, in what kind of political place is best suited to actually make something mandatory, and rather than a place where making vaccinations mandatory will has a lot more risks of fallouts and unwanted consequences in other areas as well.
So Barry, I also wanted to pick up on something that you touched on, because I think it would take us into the future of this pandemic. And that is this idea of surveillance and watching what's going on in the real world in two respects. One is another really stark contrast with the flu of 1918, which came in two major waves. And the second wave was a whole lot deadlier than the first. In the case of the current virus, we're watching these variants emerge pretty much in real time. What's so weird is that actually the UK government did a marvelous job. One of the things they actually did right was they actually had sequencing surveillance of the new, of a certain fraction of the cases. So they were able to detect variants beginning to emerge, and the South African government also detected variants. The US wasn't doing that, even though we've got more capacity than any other country in the world by a long shot, and it's cheaper here. We weren't doing it because our system was so dysfunctional. The sleeping giant is now finally waking up, but what that I think portends is that we're going to be able to detect these variants, and because of the nature of the vaccine technology, all you have to do is synthesize a new piece of RNA, pack it in the same lipids, and stick them into people's arms, and you'll have a booster that should be effective against the variants, if they work. We don't know, because the nature of the antibodies is highly unpredictable. It's still an art, not a science. We really, really lucked out. Well, it wasn't just luck. It was incredibly good targeting. But we don't know that the new variants are going to behave the same way as the original virus. And this is a breakout virus. So it hasn't been in human populations for a long time, and therefore it hasn't had a lot of time to adjust to us in the way that the TB bug has, or malaria. So there's going to be a period of adaptation. But the fact is that technology should be able to shift even as the virus shifts. And since we're humans, we can probably do that faster because we can use computers in our brains to outpace the virus. But again, that depends on having a surveillance system that actually is doing its work, and that we have deployed the system and the information is flowing appropriately into the people that can make information into decisions about what to do.
Okay. We have a couple of comments, questions that I think we might want to deal with. Number one is, should the consumption of farmed animal products be curtailed severely in order to stave off the risks of pandemic flus? Anybody have a reaction to that?
I think that probably takes us kind of outside our particular areas of expertise.
Yeah, it does. Let me take it back to you. This commentator says, I would take issue with what you said about the IP system going to be changed. No manufacturer has contributed to CTAP, and both the large companies and the countries where they're situated are fighting against the TRIPS waiver. And that's
So,
getting into the weeds a little
Yeah,
bit.
and yeah, I should be clear. Thank you for that comment, because I should be clear in what I'm saying. The thing that's been so striking about the response of the large firms hasn't been that they've backed away from their traditional commitment to the TRIPS agreement, which basically imposed North American, European IP rules for everybody. And the patent sections were largely written by lawyers from Pfizer. So it was basically play by our rules, and our rules work. And you don't see the industry backing away from that. They're still insisting that they need those rights. What I think has been so striking is they haven't used those rights. And many of the large companies have actually made public declarations that they're not intending to use those rights in the way that they normally would. So this is a stark contrast with, for example, what happened with hepatitis C, where Egypt has been able to almost eradicate hepatitis C, despite it at one point having the highest prevalence in the world. And in the US, we're only treating 1 in 6 patients. And the difference is 1 in 6 infected people. The difference is because in the US, we privilege the rules and the financial aspects of innovation, whereas in Egypt, they treat it as a public health priority.
Yeah.
And I think I perceive a shift to the public health framework beginning to gain. And I think that while the companies haven't gotten there yet, I think their behavior on this particular, with respect to the vaccines and the treatments, I think sets a precedent that's going to be hard to back away from. So I'm not saying there's not going to be a fight, and I think there will be a fight, and I expect industry to be fighting, kicking and screaming, dragged into a new framework, but I think a new framework will emerge.
Hope you're right.
Mary,
Okay.
even though
Yeah.
this is outside of my area of expertise, as Bob was saying, I think I'll jump in. We do need to take a look at our animal agriculture industry. I mean, not only, in relation to just ethical questions, what should we eat? But if we take, if we're going to attend to how do we prevent new entities from emerging? I know we're looking at climate change, but we have to address how we handle that industrial animal agriculture industry on the front side as well as on the back side. We saw a lot of individuals who were essential workers in this industry who were exposed to the virus, and what kind of protections did they have? And so I think we have to look at it from a prevention standpoint, as well as once something emerges, how do we protect the people who are working in the industry as well?
Yep, I agree. So we have 9 new messages. I have not read them all. Let me take a look. Oh my, okay. Let's see. Here's to all panelists. While vaccination appears to be a great success, it seems that treatment development is underfunded, if not left out. We still have people dying on the ICU without real treatment options and without any advances in treatment. Any opinions about resource distribution and justice, Ray, prevention versus treatment? Anybody want to take that?
Well, yeah, I'll step in here because I don't think we know how the story is going to end yet. The vaccines are surprisingly effective. If you'd asked, people did ask me a year ago, and I predicted that the vaccines would be really, really hard to develop. based on the fact that we had been working for 20 years trying to develop vaccines against the common cold versions of coronaviruses with no success. And the fact that they come back year after year. So it suggests that the immunity that we do have is not very durable. And yet here we have the vaccines burst out of the door really quickly and are highly effective. So that's actually a surprise. I think the fact is that there are many vulnerabilities in this virus that we're going to figure out now that there's some money flowing in the direction of R&D. This really was a backwater. Coronavirus stuff up until SARS was truly a backwater. And even after SARS and MERS, which are also coronaviruses, there wasn't a huge uptick in focused research on developing new antivirals. And mainly what they had was leftovers from the hepatitis C efforts of Gilead and Pharmasset and other companies that were mainly focused on hepatitis C and HIV. So I think we will see some probably pretty effective treatments because this is a really weird virus. And it's got vulnerabilities. So I think we will have some treatments, and I don't think that story's over, but I think the R&D part of it that we were good at was figuring out how to do a vaccine and studying the spike protein, but we haven't done as good a job of probing the other vulnerabilities of the coronaviruses and the other viruses that are out there. Dina,
Do we have any reason to be hopeful about the durability of this vaccine? Because now we don't really know. We don't have the experience yet to know.
That's right. The most hopeful sign about the durability has been the recent work on T cells, which seem to remember, no matter how many variants you throw at it, the T cells seem to remember. So that doesn't suggest you're going to be immune to infection. It suggests that if you are infected, you're less likely to get a really severe disease that results from it. That's kind of hopeful, but who knows? We're only 1 year into this, so we don't know.
Right. Okay, let me take a look at a couple of the other questions that have come up. Oh my, let's see. Oh, look at these questions. Among the things we should do, I think, is re-inspect the ethics and efficacy of traditional methods of infection control, quarantine, isolation, shunning, and exile, cordon sanitaire, travel restrictions, contact tracing, Bluetooth, and other tracing apps. Don't we need to think these through again? And my first response is we need to think everything through. And you've just pointed out that the vaccine development process and efficacy was startling in its effectiveness. Well, that's not so true of the other old public health tools generally. My answer is yes. Is there a more robust answer than that?
I think Stefan can probably answer this really, really well, because I really appreciated what Stefan brought to this conversation in terms of looking at all the values and all of the consequences beyond just health. If we take a look at health beyond just absence of disease, we need to think through, I think, all of these public health measures to see what their cost effectiveness is and how they might shun or stigmatize certain people. And maybe if we can find least restrictive alternatives, one of our best tools right now is mask wearing, and at least mask wearing, we can do this in a much more equitable way than, say, quarantining people at home. I really enjoyed reading Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year last year over again, because you can see once you take the shunning and the home confinement to a certain degree, you really are interfering with people's lives, livelihoods, and rights. But I don't know, and maybe this is a question for Dina as well, or for you, Barry. Are there least restrictive alternatives that we can put into place that will reduce our risks overall, and also allow the vaccines to work without providing more kindling in the meantime?
I think, maybe I'll pass this to Dina. I'm on my university's benefits committee, budget committee. There's money involved, I'm on it. And I think you talked about the behavioral sciences, behavioral economics tools nudging, something that in the benefits committee, we look at all the ways in which we can enhance wellness by bribes, incentives, positives rather than negatives, push people. reframe things? I mean, what you mentioned this in your initial write-up, looking at nudges.
Right. I mean, I think one has to be real careful about those nudges. We know that most employee-based wellness programs don't work, for example.
Right. Right.
And what they really seem to do pretty well is to shift the financial burden to the employees from the employers. They work at that.
Yeah.
But so you have to be careful about that. But, in terms of Lee's question, I find it sort of fascinating, maybe not so surprising, but fascinating. That's something where I completely agree with you, that the wearing of masks doesn't stop anything you can do, right? I mean, it doesn't stop going to a cinema. Maybe it stops kissing and eating, but, and I'm a wind player, it stops that. But for the most part, it's the least intrusive thing you can possibly think of. And yet look at the absolutely crazy political fallout that there has been. So least intrusive seems to me an extremely subjective thing. To me, masks are about as unintrusive as you can get. But I guess there are people who'd rather not go to the theater if it means they have to put a thing on their face. So it's complicated.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are, I think, three more. We still have a little time left. So one of the attendees asks, what suggestions do you have for helping bring humanities and social science perspectives to the fore in planning preparation for the next pandemic? Stefan, I guess that's the ball's in your court.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm on one of these expert panels from the Scottish government, which is also like nice, that someone seems to have noticed that maybe there's something that social sciences contribute, but everything has been sort of on the soft stuff around the edges, like who are the people who are vaccine hesitant, and how can we overcome vaccine hesitation? Is vaccine hesitation related to socioeconomic status or migration backgrounds, things like that, basically? But I think that the kind of social science contribution just could go so much further than that. And again, it would just sort of requires, I mean, again, for me, the biggest shock event of all of this was really what was happening in India during the first lockdown, where just interventions were taken without any regard to anything other than health. If you take sort of preserving as many lives as possible, and even that wasn't quite clear what that actually meant. Would you prolong lifespans, or just sort of save people from trips to the hospital, or exactly what would that mean? But sort of health was taken as the only measure, and then sort of which then meant that hundreds of thousands of people were forced to just walk back to their villages because they were unemployed, they were hungry, they had nothing else to do. It's just this incredibly blinkered, just sort of complete disregard of any other criteria that you should actually look for when you take any kind of intervention. And I guess, in the US, in the UK, we've been incredibly lucky because we just sort of went to our homes, locked the doors, internet on, heating on, food supplies via the internet, everything fine. But that was not the case in so many other countries and so many other settings. And all of that needs to be considered also. I think we were just so, I mean, also kind of the enormous amount of taken for granted infrastructure that sort of really cushioned the blow of all of this happening. I think it's just really amazing when you think back to that. And again, though, I mean, we just need so much more reflection on what the criteria are that we will actually take into account, and maybe even trying to, I mean, this term that I'm working with is sort of biocommensuration. Commensuration is a form of can you actually trade one thing with another if they are completely separate from each other, right? You cannot really, money and health, these are different in different spheres, but we are still making them compatible all the time. And are there more structured, institutionally and established ways of commensurating very different interventions that then kind of not way beyond health, basically? And I think that just needs to be worked out so much more, and that just needs so much more social science literacy also, I think, on all levels.
Yeah, I agree. Okay,
Let me just follow.
Ruth Macklin has a question, I think targeted more specifically at Dina, but to all of us.
Yeah, so
Do you see it? Yeah.
So Ruth was asking about some of the possible fallout from vaccination mandates, and pointing out that even with something as obviously, as superficially simple as masks, that we've had governors in various states refusing to do mask mandates and so on. And like most other things in the US, yes, it will be state specific and maybe even city specific and county specific. But I think it's, certainly possible to start where you do have agreement. States like, maybe Democratic states, I don't know, New York and so on, would begin, and maybe there would always be holdouts. But what I think would be kind of interesting would be, if you lived in, it's one thing to live in, I don't know, South Dakota. I think I remember they never had a mask mandate. Live in South Dakota, and if you want to go to Illinois, you've got to purchase a mask for $1 and put it on, and then you take it off when you go home. It's different if you have to get a vaccination in order to move from your non-mandate state to a mandated region. But I think that that could be positive in the sense that people would think, oh gosh, I really like to live in my, particularly libertarian state, but I also have to do business across my state border, or my kid goes to college in a different state or whatever. So there's all this interaction. If I want to participate in that interaction, then I have to get mandated. I have to get vaccinated, or I can't do things that I want to do. The downside, of course, is that we would intensify the separation that we're already experiencing between people who live in one kind of political world and believe one thing, and those of us who live in another political world. And whether the election was truly won by Biden, or whether the COVID pandemic is a real thing and so on. If people just said, well, I can't go and to the movies in the next state if I don't get vaccinated, so I'll just stay home, then this could exacerbate. In Canada in the 70s, there was a great term between the Francophones and Anglophones. I think it was called the two silences or something. And I think that we could be moving toward that. So that would be a downside.
Okay, there's another question here.
I was wondering if we might go just for a second back to the question that was posed to Stefan about the social sciences.
Yes.
The thing I wanted to observe is look at his first graph, which was, it was intended to predict who's ready for a pandemic.
Right.
And the technocrats didn't get it wrong, because the things that they were measuring were necessary. But the thing to really observe is that they were wrong, in the sense that 500,000 Americans are dead, not because those parts of the system didn't work, but because the rest of the system didn't work, and the failures were socio-political.
Yep.
The failures were not technical for the most part. And that's why I think that's pretty obvious. Gosh, that's where you would try to fix the problem, and you need to talk to people who know about that sort of thing, and that's not going to be the molecular biologists.
Yeah. Yeah, we need some new university departments, don't we?
Maybe we need another Elsie, full employment for ethicists.
Yeah, right. So there's a question here that comes out of, follows, I think, from what you were saying, Bob. This is from Richard Cash. Given that the mortality in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and East Asia is 1/10 to 1/100 of the US, Europe, and much of South America, why should these countries invest money in a COVID vaccine strategy rather than for some other target that represents other comorbidities in their countries? So I think there may, and I don't know enough about why there'd be this differential, but anybody have a response to this question?
Yeah, so Mukherjee just did a really nice piece in the New Yorker on this very question. And, I think it's a really, really good question. And I think the answer is, I hope it stays that way. Because if it does stay that way, then I think it's right that that's not their top priority, and they should be able to set their own priorities. I'm not so sure it's going to stay that way, and I worry that it isn't. And it's that uncertainty that is the answer to that question, which is, you know what, if it comes into those countries and loses control, like if you talk to the people in rural Illinois, up until November, they thought they were immune, and then suddenly, bang, it hits. So, and that can happen with the pandemic. So I don't know which way it's going to go.
So the long and short answer there is we still need more time to figure out a lot of this. It's still very early.
But it's a very good question. And again, one where, it's also, Bob mentioned this also, like this coronavirus is just throwing up so many mysteries. It is an extremely strange virus also, and that's something that fascinated me all along also, because it just doesn't behave the way that you usually find infectious diseases also to behave. When you look at everything else really that we know in global health, tuberculosis, AIDS, what have you, it's always poorer countries, people with lower immune systems, more hunger, all these factors, they invariably are harder hit. And coronavirus is just the flip side of that. There's an absolutely clear relationship between high socioeconomic standing in terms of GDP and just how badly affected population actually is. And to this day, no one's actually worked out why that is, I think. And it's like the usual answer is like, yeah, but it's the sort of the demographics. Well, look at Japan. Japan also just doesn't fit that at all. They have very high GDP, very low mortality. It cannot be that. It cannot be age structure. It cannot be so many of the things that we're used to. And again, why Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have these extremely low, relatively low mortality rates, we still don't know really. And of course, we need to know this because precisely again, because it comes back to this question of what's worth investing in. And yeah, you definitely don't want to have a situation which has also occurred so many times. This is something that kind of the social science literature on Africa and Asia has described many, many times, is that there's sort of one highlight disease, and then all the resources are being thrown at it. And then that creates the silo effect that a lot of other things that actually affect far more people, far more severely, they get no press coverage, no one cares about them. And that's, they get no one looks at them anymore. So, we definitely need to get the balance right there in every regard. And it's completely possible that, of course, depending on just how expensive these vaccines are and how expensive it is to roll them out and so on, but it's completely possible that for a lot of countries, it's not nearly as worth it as it is for the US and the UK, for example, to actually invest full on in these vaccines.
Right. One more question. I think we'll have to end it at 11:15. This question is about preparedness for pandemics. How would you see as a governance system to avoid silos between the various sectors involved? How to balance international and national levels? Well, that's an interesting question. I have a friend who's director of one of the NIH vaccine subunits. He travels all the time. He's always on the move. he's like a connector all by himself. And he's been doing this for 30, 40 years now as a vaccine expert. So it seems to me, this is a question of what we should know and maybe don't know about how connectiveness works. It seems to me built in some ways to some of these health issues. I don't know if you can program that. It sort of happens from the bottom up, I think, with people involved in it. Any other grand responses? Then I think we'll leave that question for the audience to write articles about. Thank you very much. It's great to see you guys. Great to have questions. And I think we raised a lot of good issues and a lot of data there. And Stefan, I want to see this article.
Me too.
Very interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it sounds like you're on the right track. And Reed, I just loved your detail about Pennsylvania, because I was thinking about the county system for public health. And of course, I live in Pennsylvania. And
Me
Lee,
too.
you gave a very elegant perspective using another model, which is a good reminder. Thanks to everybody. Bob had to
And
leave.
thanks to Brochet for organizing this.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thanks to Brochet.
Barry for cheering.
Meetups are
Absolutely.
terrific. Hope to see you guys again soon in Geneva.
Yep. Take care. Bye.
You too.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Stay safe, everyone.
Okay.